Hello there, this is the beginning of Unit 5, and we'll start with the 5.01 lesson. The Cold War reached a boiling point in the early 1960s as the superpowers approached the brink of nuclear war in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, fears of communist expansion led the United States into its longest war, a war that would tear the nation apart and take a terrible toll in lives and the country's image abroad and at home. New voices emerged during these tumultuous years, demanding civil rights for every group in the American mosaic. And secrecy, corruption, and scandal in the White House shook Americans' faith in their government. The 1960s and 70s left the United States exhausted. Where would Americans turn as they moved forward? Hence the name of Unit 5, A Time of Turmoil. And starting with Lesson 5.01, Crisis. Fighting communism remained the theme of American foreign policy throughout the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations. A wall constructed through the heart of Berlin made the distinction between communism and democracy even clearer. But that conflict was more than an ocean away. When the threat came closer, President Kennedy had to react, forcibly and effectively. Would he be able to do so? Goals for this lesson. Explain the reasons for and symbolism of the Berlin Wall. Identify on a map Cuba and its proximity to the United States. And lastly, summarize the reasons for and key events of the Cuban Missile Crisis and its outcome. And that's going to be your graded assignment for today. Let's go to Lesson Resources. Make sure to get your reading guide and or lesson answer key. And let's begin reading pages 828 through 832. The Vietnam Era. During the late 1950s and into the 1960s, as marches, urban violence, and landmark legislation brought the civil rights movement to a peak, the Cold War did not stop. In the ongoing standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, the world's two nuclear-armed superpowers, American leaders faced not only social upheavals at home, but old and new crises abroad. In 1961, when John F. Kennedy took office as president, he intended to focus his energies on the Cold War. He once remarked privately to Richard Nixon, "Foreign affairs is the only important issue for a president to handle, isn't it?" Although the civil rights movement quickly corrected that misimpression, from the outset, Kennedy had his hands full with foreign affairs of the highest importance. In Kennedy's time, the continuing commitment of the United States to resist the spread of communism would bring the nation perilously close to the brink of nuclear war. During Kennedy's administration and those that followed, the United States would be dragged deeper and deeper into a long and savage war in Vietnam, a war that would divide the nation and make many people question whether the effort to stop the advance of communism was worth the economic and moral price. The Berlin Wall. As president, Kennedy did not break sharply from the foreign policy of his predecessors, Truman and Eisenhower. Like them, he focused on the containment of communism. When he declared in his inaugural address that America would pay any price, bear any burden, to ensure the survival and success of liberty, he was clearly thinking of the threat posed by the Soviets and their allies. In June of 1961, John F. Kennedy met with the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, in Vienna, Austria. The two most powerful leaders in the world spent 2 days talking about many topics. They debated whether communism was destined to overcome capitalism. They spent many hours discussing trouble spots such as Germany and especially the city of Berlin, tensely divided into Western and Soviet zones. In their talks, Khrushchev tried to bully Kennedy. When the president criticized the Soviet Union for intervening in the affairs of other countries, Khrushchev angrily accused him of hypocrisy. The United States, too, he pointed out, had military forces all over the world. It was the Americans, he declared, who had delusions of grandeur, thinking they were so rich and powerful that they could afford not to recognize the rights of others. Shortly after this meeting, new tensions arose over the city of Berlin. Since the division of the city, some 2.5 million East Germans, including the many highly trained workers and professionals, had sought freedom in the West by crossing from East to West Berlin. The East German economy threatened to collapse because of this flood of departures. American leaders feared the Soviets might try to take West Berlin by force. Instead, in the summer of 1961, the East Germans, with Soviet approval, built a 12-foot-high wall between the two portions of the city, manned by guards with instructions to shoot anyone who tried to climb over. For roughly the next 3 decades, the Berlin Wall would stand as a hated symbol of communist oppression. And here is a picture of the wall soon after it was built. The Soviet premier watched to see how the American president would respond. Kennedy quickly mobilized military reserve units and reinforced the brigade of American troops in West Berlin. His actions signaled that America was prepared to use force to defend the surrounded city. It soon became evident, however, that he was not prepared to risk war with the Soviet Union by demolishing the Berlin Wall. The president commented realistically, "It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." Kennedy's response led Khrushchev to conclude that the American president was timid and indecisive. Crisis in Cuba. Kennedy would face his toughest foreign policy challenges much closer to home, in Cuba, an island in the Caribbean Sea just 90 miles off of the coast of Florida. When Kennedy took office, Cuba's government had only recently fallen into the hands of a strong-willed communist dictator, Fidel Castro. Kennedy and many Americans were alarmed by the presence of a communist regime on America's doorstep. Castro's rise to power. Prior to Castro's takeover, Cuba was ruled by a corrupt and brutal dictator, Fulgencio Batista. The United States supported Batista because he helped protect American interests on the island. Many Cubans, including Castro, resented the United States both for its economic dominance and for its support of the dictator. They especially resented the fact that many Americans had become rich by doing business in Cuba, while much of the island's population remained desperately poor. These facts of Cuban life, poverty and domination by a dictator with American backing, convinced Fidel Castro the only solution to Cuba's problems lay in revolution. Here's a picture of Castro here in the middle and others that were following him. He formed a guerrilla band and staged hit-and-run attacks on Batista's soldiers. Many Cubans, especially the poor, joined Castro's forces. On New Year's Day, 1959, the capital city of Havana fell to Castro's rebels, and Batista fled the country. Castro took charge of Cuba. His regime introduced health care and schools across the island. Although Castro had fought to overthrow a dictator, it quickly became clear that Castro would be no more democratic than Batista had been. He executed and imprisoned his opponents. Worse, from the American point of view, he established a communist regime, with the government controlling the economy. Castro's government confiscated all major companies, starting with those owned by Americans. Such actions won him the friendship of the Soviet Union, which promised economic and military aid. Aid and influence. Let's read this insert before we go on. In the wake of Cuba's 1959 revolution, U.S. policymakers were eager to counter the perceived threat of communism spreading into Latin America. In his inaugural address, President Kennedy made a special pledge to our sister republics south of our border. He promised a new alliance for progress, to assist free men and free governments in casting off the chains of poverty. Congress readily approved JFK's Alliance for Progress programs designed to foster economic cooperation between North and South America. By increasing American economic aid to Latin American governments, the United States also aimed to strengthen its political influence in the region. Kennedy also stepped up efforts to build goodwill in the developing world by creating the Peace Corps, a league of mostly college-age volunteers who helped improve local communities, taught literacy and health classes, and sought to foster better ties between the First World and the Third World. The agency's mission, according to the act authorizing it, is to promote world peace and friendship through a Peace Corps, which shall make available to interested countries and areas men and women in the United States qualified for service abroad and willing to serve, under the conditions of hardship if necessary, to help the peoples of such countries and areas in meeting their needs for trained manpower. From Africa to Asia to South America, Peace Corps volunteers have served as ambassadors of American goodwill. At its peak in 1966, the agency sent out some 15,000 volunteers. The Peace Corps remains active today. Okay, back to the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy was unwilling to accept a communist foothold in the Western Hemisphere, especially so close to the United States. Soon after taking office, he approved a secret plan for the invasion of Cuba. There would be no U.S. troops in the invasion force, since a direct U.S. attack against Castro might provoke the Soviet Union to respond. Instead, the United States armed and trained a force of some 1,500 Cuban exiles who had fled Castro's dictatorship. The Americans hoped that an amphibious assault by these exiles would inspire the Cuban people to rise up and overthrow Castro. In April 1961, the small army of Cuban exiles landed on the island's coast at a place called the Bay of Pigs. But Castro had been tipped off about their arrival. He attacked with troops, planes, and Soviet-made tanks. The United States had promised air support for the exiles, but at the last minute, Kennedy changed his mind out of fear that it might expose the U.S. role. Within 3 days, almost all the invaders had been killed or captured. The Bay of Pigs disaster deeply humiliated the United States. Not only had the promised revolt failed to occur, but the invasion increased support for Castro among the nationalistic Cubans who cheered his defiance of the country they called the Colossus of the North. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was impressed by Castro's successful defiance of the United States. He decided that the Soviet Union should give Cuba its full support. Khrushchev reasoned that supporting Cuba would help equalize the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Americans possessed many more nuclear weapons than the Soviets and had missiles pointing at Soviet Union from nearby Turkey. Khrushchev decided to station no nuclear missiles in Cuba. In the summer of 1962, rumors spread that Cuba had offensive missiles. In October 1962, President Kennedy's advisors brought him an alarming report. An American spy plane had photographed nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. The construction was just days away from completion. When finished, the sites would be able to launch nuclear missiles that could hit cities in the United States. Kennedy quickly began a series of nearly non-stop meetings with his top military leaders and statesmen. Some urged the president to bomb the missile sites before they were ready for use. Some argued that he should also invade Cuba by air and sea. Others warned that an attack on the island could prompt the Soviets to seize West Berlin. A nuclear war might well start. Some urged Kennedy to avoid confrontation and try diplomacy. Kennedy realized that he had little time for diplomacy. He believed that if the United States appeared weak in the face of this threat, it would encourage the Soviet arms buildup in the Western Hemisphere. But the young commander-in-chief also distrusted the top military men who urged an attack. He had served in the Navy in World War II and had become convinced that war between the superpowers, especially nuclear war, would be catastrophic. Faced with few options and potentially disastrous consequences, the president ordered a naval blockade around Cuba in order to keep more weapons from reaching the island and to pressure the Soviets to dismantle the existing missile sites. Kennedy realized that if his strategy failed, he might soon be leading his country into a third world war. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the nation on television. He told the nation and the world about the Soviet missiles in Cuba and about the American naval blockade. He announced that all ships approaching the island would be stopped and searched to make sure they carried no weapons that could be used to attack another nation. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to the world peace, Kennedy said. He also declared that the use of Soviet nuclear weapons anywhere in the Western Hemisphere will lead to a retaliatory attack on the Soviet Union. Khrushchev responded that a naval blockade of Cuba was an act of aggression and a violation of international law. He cautioned that if U.S. Navy vessels had tried to stop the Soviet ships at sea, Soviet subs might sink them. The USSR would not start a nuclear war, he warned, but if the United States insists on war, we'll all meet together in hell. As the crisis deepened, Americans stocked up on food and emergency supplies and formed long lines at gas stations. Schools held air raid drills. Millions of city dwellers, fearing they lived in a nuclear target, left their homes and fled to the countryside. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Soviet and American officials negotiated frantically. The Soviets reminded the Americans that the United States had just put missiles in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union. Could they not understand the Soviets felt just as threatened by the American missiles? But Kennedy stuck to his demand. The Cuban missiles had to go. At the end of October, the Soviets backed down. They agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for an end to the blockade and an American pledge not to invade the island. Secretary of State Dean Rusk commented, "We were eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow blinked." But Khrushchev gained something he wanted too. Kennedy had secretly agreed to withdraw U.S. missiles from Turkey. The tense standoff between the two superpowers in the Cuban Missile Crisis had an unexpected result. It led to a thaw in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. Frightened by their journey to the nuclear brink, the two nations began talks aimed at limiting the use of nuclear weapons. Thanks to his tough but measured handling of the missile crisis, Kennedy's popularity soared. The world has never again come so close to a nuclear catastrophe. Of those 2 weeks in October 1962, one historian has said, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the most dangerous event in human history. Okay, let's read this. I am a Berliner, and then we'll go back. On June 26, 1963, 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy traveled to West Berlin and stood before the Berlin Wall, a grim symbol of the divide between communist and democratic nations. In the shadow of the wall, he gave a speech proclaiming support for the struggle of West Berliners to maintain an island of freedom within communist Germany, East Germany. The crowd roared his approval when he said that all free men, wherever they live, are citizens of Berlin, and then declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am a Berliner. So don't forget to go back to get your reading guide, fill in the answers, and check your answers with the lesson answer key. And in the next video, we'll complete the rest of the lesson.